Presented by Bonnie Shirley. She is a OLLI member who also is taking classes to get smarter all the time. And she's normally a very nice person, but don't push it. Is that fair?
That's accurate. We're going to talk about aerial archaeology today. It's, hello. It's fairly new. It's really started about maybe 100 years ago, clearly with airplanes. It got its strongest push at World War I, but even before that, they were doing some balloon aerial pictures. Not quite understanding what they were doing. They were playing, but they were trying. This is the kind of thing that you get with an aerial view. If you were looking at this on the ground, it's 310 feet long. Would you have any sense of how magnificent it is? Not a bit. There are many things in the world like this that we cannot see from the ground. We can't appreciate what the people who did this, what was driving them, what were they telling us, who were they talking to? We don't know, but this is the only way we can really appreciate it, is from above. So thank God we do have aerial archaeology now. It has really grown in the 20th and 21st century. It is becoming just a magnificent tool for archaeologists. There are a few who object. They say, it's important that we still keep digging. Well, yes, that's very true, because once you do the aerial archaeology, what you need to do then is something called ground truthing, right? This is the beginnings. For years, they were limited to looking for a likely place to excavate based on written history, archives, regional geophysics. There were early tentative trips by balloonists in the late 19th century, even early drone attempts with cameras attached to small balloons. And I just thought that was so creative and so smart. They didn't know exactly why they were doing it, but they knew it was a good thing to do. It was not until after World War I that aerial archaeology took off via aerial surveys. And many of those surveys, by the way, were done on behalf of the military. So for some of these things, both in the UK and the United States, some of these aerial views were not released until later, but many of them were available. These photographs revealed surprising marks not easily seen on the ground by ground observers. This is a little difficult to see, but the picture up on the right has a circle in it very faintly and a square. Can most of you see it? I know it's very faint. You cannot see it at all from the ground. Those are parts of a mound built by Native Americans. So what's left after 200 years of farming in the area? One time before the farmers arrived, probably there was a large mound still left. That's what's left. You can't see that. The farmer can't see that from the ground. I can't see that from the ground. You can only see this remnant by air. This was taken by an American archaeologist named Reeves in 1936. I like this one. 1928, that's when they really started realizing what they had. Badbury, actually, Hill Camp, 1928, photo taken 5,000 feet, and it's probably a fort dated around 2,800 years before the Romans. So, in 1928, a gentleman named Crawford published Wessex from the Air, probably the first book offering detailed archaeological features located via air. He's considered a pioneer in the field. In fact, the UK itself is such a small place that when you do aerial surveys of all the farming land, you're getting a lot of crop marks because of the fact that it is very tiny. There have been so many people and so many kinds of people living there, and all of them left their mark on the land. Landscape archaeologists, which are the people that look at an entire area, use many tools, and they synthesize the information provided from these sources: observation, walking the area, flyovers, survey, grid sampling, oral and indigenous history, and you'd be surprised sometimes when you see something puzzling on the land, just ask the local people. They have the answers. It's very surprising how much indigenous oral history remains in many areas. Australia is a good example. Those are the tools that they use, but remote sensing and aerial surveys have become integral to many studies. British and aerial archaeology, they were an important resource in World War I. They were also important in World War II because they did so many surveys. I like this one in particular. This is RAF Biggin Hill, 1941, and the white spots are from German bombing raids. Pretty sad, isn't it? They really went through a lot. There are also archaeological sites that specialize in aircraft, locating missing or lost aircraft, and marine archaeology. There are sites that specialize in lost ships as well. So this is what England thinks of when they're doing this kind of work. They want identification and understanding of buried sites visible as crop marks and soil marks, as well as those surviving as earthworks or standing structures. They want assessments of monument condition over time. They do, because they're so small and centralized, they actually do a better job of this than the US does. Strategic planning and research for mitigation of landscapes and detection of erosion. Data for management of protected landscapes. Data to inform the local planning process, including key information for desk-based assessments. That sounds so British, doesn't it? They're really so organized. So we can do this. Just, you know, get in line, get a desk, we can do it. Identification of regionally and locally important sites, information for farm stewardship through the selected heritage inventory, information to enhance landscape characterization studies, etc. So if you want to see more and you want to see more aerial shots like this, go to historicengland.org.uk. Flying to learn. This is interesting, and I don't have a laser pointer, or if I do, it's well hidden. But you can see over here, this is one of the things that makes a crop mark. Just walking this field here, and it could be wheat, it could be anything, you would probably not see those marks. Or you would wonder, why is my crop greener right there than elsewhere? That tells you how a crop mark is made. They're called soil marks or crop marks. You see them aerially, you frequently don't see them walking. These are all marks that are either Roman or prehistoric. They're not just the land acting crazy. They're not crops acting crazy. When you go down and you excavate, you find that within those marks is a settlement, a house, a circle, a fort, whatever it may be. They leave marks on the land. Interesting to know that human beings can have churned the land up 2,000 years ago, and it's still going to show 2,000 years later. If you go down deep enough, you will find soil that has never been touched. But any place there are humans, you're going to find a mark on the land somewhere, somehow, and the only way we know about it now is by aerial flights. If it's higher and greener, see on the right there? That's where there was probably a ditch. Somebody may have built it 2,000 years ago, but that ditch has rich soil and more moisture. If there's an old Roman wall covered under your crop will not grow well there, and it will show. The forms show in the land. And it is amazing how long this can continue to speak to us. This is the Corrants crop mark in Wales. You can see that's not natural. At least I hope you can see that. That is probably an ancient fort of some kind, a protected area, an enclosure. You can see where the opening is on it. And it shows up in the land all these years later. And yet it's probably 2,500 years old. This is different year, different lighting. It's much fainter. And what aerial archaeologists do, one of the things they do is take pictures at different angles and at different times of day. And they're going to get a different result each time. This one was shown up by the fact that Wales was undergoing a drought. And suddenly, no crops, that crop mark, that soil mark showed up. And it's a large Iron Age structure, probably several thousand years old, maybe 2,500 years old. Probably would have looked something like that. And these are Iron Age Britons. See all the plaids they're wearing? Plaids and tartans are not new. Any questions about that?
What did you say they were wearing?
Tartans and plaids, even 2,000 years ago. So here's a little bit in the United States. Who's been to Chaco Canyon? A few of you have been. It's a pretty wonderful place, isn't it? Pretty fantastic. Why would rangers and archaeologists care about doing, I mean, we know it so well. Why would we need to do aerial views of Chaco Canyon? What are some of the reasons? Well, some of the reasons would be you want to see, it's an easier way to see if looting is occurring, damage is occurring, erosion is occurring, what's happening. This gives you a large-scale view. And people will loot if they're not caught. You're not even supposed to take a chip of anything away. And people still do it. You can see the damage. Look at the damage up in the corner there from a rock fall. I'm sure that's been there a long time. But you want to see if it's moved. You want to see if there are any changes. Are there any other rock falls coming? So it's very interesting. They need to be able to look at it from a large point of view for looting, for changes, for erosion. So aerial archaeologists, which includes people working for the National Park Service, will do these kind of photos for just that reason. This is interesting. You can see it on ground, but you can see one or two of them at a time. That is 137 feet long, and it was made sometime between 400 AD and 1200 AD, long before contact. What were they doing? Why were they doing that? Who did it? How long did it take them? That's a lot of work. You can still slightly see the raised mounds. If they weren't being maintained now, they probably would have disappeared. And because they're on a mountaintop, they haven't been plowed under, which is what's happened to the bulk of the mounds and the glyphs in the United States. That is remarkable work, and there are hundreds of these things at this National Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa. And many modern tribes claim association with it, and they're probably right. It's quite remarkable. It is amazing, and the amount of work for this thing, 70 feet wide, 137 feet long, and there are so many of them. How much work? No horses, no wheels, no trained engineers, and yet they're beautifully made and in a wonderful curve. How did they do that? And why did they do that? Because it took a lot of work away from just surviving. You've got to be able to dedicate time to do that. Why? And if we couldn't see them aerially, would we even know about them or value them? Geoglyphs in the Amazon jungle. This is fairly new. How many people remember seeing pictures of Amazon tribes and they look so, quote unquote, primitive, which is not a word I like used about human groups of any kind. They just, they're living in the jungle, living off of the jungle. They have little bows and arrows and that kind of thing. Who were these people? Because isn't the Amazon totally pristine? No, hasn't it been there for thousands of years without being touched? Apparently not. because once they started cutting the Amazon forest down in these areas in the western Amazon, Bolivia and Brazil, they started finding these things. There are 400 that they have found. They stretch about 1,000 miles. What? Who are these people? What is that about? You know, the little tribes with the tiny little poison arrows did not do that unless it was their ancestors who did it. These people disappeared maybe around 600 years ago. There were 16th century and 17th century travelers that reported seeing some earthworks at the time, and then they were kind of forgotten about until the forest started being cut down. And then aerially, we began to see these. What if they just plowed them under? Which they could have if we didn't have these aerial surveys. They're remarkable. We don't know what they're for. And in fact, settlements where people actually lived seem to be separate from this. But it stretches 1,000 miles. Who was this? What were they doing? Who were they talking to? Did they have any connection to the Nazca lines and the Nazca people? Is it just entirely somebody else? No clue. And we just don't know. Without aerial views, we wouldn't have known they existed. It was once written by archaeologists that pre-European Amazonian societies were mainly considered to be primitive egalitarian tribes living in small, impermanent villages in a hostile environment, unable to develop complex socio-political institutions. Translation, you guys are not as smart as us white guys. So that's the kind of attitude they had. You know, this was back in the 50s and 60s. That's what they thought, unfortunately. And it's sad because actually archaeological information was very scarce for the region. It doesn't last long in tropical areas. At least some of the things don't last long. Certainly human skeletons do not. The massive destruction of the cultures of the people of the New World after European contact should have made them hesitant to render opinions, but it did not. So they had their little Euro-centered opinions about these people without really knowing much. So we can discard a lot of that information because we don't know what people were doing, what were they thinking. This is a lot of effort to be taken away from daily actions of survival. So clearly they had the labor force and somebody was driving it. Some kind of political or religious point of view was driving it. What was it? We may never know. We may never know. But now we know nobody is as primitive as, quote unquote, we white people used to think. It's not even a good point of view anymore. There are hundreds more of these, but you'd probably have to cut down more of the forest to see them. So maybe it's time for somebody rich, to come up with LiDAR surveys. How about that? What would we see? This was a discovery by air. The Turkish government just happened to do a lot of aerial photos of this particular lake, Iznik Lake in Turkey. And an archaeologist, Mustafa Sahin, looked at him. He said, "What? What the heck is this?" I mean, there's a lot of people living around this lake. Nobody had noticed it before. Apparently, the lake is often, you can't see very well through it, at least if you're just on a boat or from the shore. You can't see through it very well because it's full of algae. But the aerial photos showed this. And it turns out it is a very old early Christian basilica. It collapsed due to an earthquake in about 740 AD. More than 1,000 years ago, and it had been built even earlier, probably over a Greek temple. This was the area called Nicaea. What?
It was the Council of Nicaea, which is a famous thing.
That's right.
So it would probably be a visiting area, but the Greek temple may be taken over by the new religion.
Yes, that's exactly what they're thinking. And in fact, perhaps it's that, no. It may be that particular basilica is where the council met. So they're working on analysis and excavation now, but it's been hidden for what? It's now 2014 when they found it. It's been hidden for how many years? 1,300 almost. And it's older than that. So it may be the very basilica that was involved in that council. So what is remote sensing? This is really common. You're going to see it all over the place with Hurricane Florence. You're going to see it all over the place with Google Earth. How many people have used Google Earth? It's a wonderful thing. I love Google Earth. And when you just go into an ordinary real estate site and look up an address, they're going to give you a Google Earth view of that address. That's how common Google Earth is everywhere in our lives now. And that's part of remote sensing. It is the process of detecting and monitoring the physical characteristics of an area by measuring its reflected and emitted radiation at a distance from the targeted area. The technology of it, the way it works, is not clear to me. Don't ask me any questions. But I love it. I know it exists. I think it's wonderful. I'm not quite sure how it works. Special cameras collect remotely sensed images of the Earth, which help researchers sense things about the Earth. That makes sense. We're used to seeing these views now, aren't we, of floods and damage and earthquakes. This can include flyovers by planes in addition to satellites and drones. So cameras on satellites and airplanes take images of large areas of the Earth's surface, allowing us to see so much more. Sonar systems on ships can be used to create images of the ocean floor. And cameras on satellites can be used to make images of temperature changes in the oceans. There is so much wonderful technology and science going on around us at all times, and we actually can't keep up with most of it. It's just, I love it. I don't always know how it works, but I love it. So large forest fires can be mapped from space, allowing rangers to see a much larger area than from the ground. Tracking clouds to help predict the weather or watch erupting volcanoes. You can just imagine the use of it for disaster purposes. Now, of course, it's also for spying, but it has a lot of other wonderful uses as well. This is flooding in Louisiana due to prolonged rainfall. What are we likely to see in North Carolina, South Carolina right now? Something very similar. We have it here. We have a remote sensing laboratory here at Cal State Fullerton. It is part of the geography department. And this is the software they use. If you dare ask me what any of that means. The ERDAS Imagine 2013 full suite with AtCore NV 5.0 plus IDL 8.2, ARGIS 10.5, and other ESRI products, Adobe CS6 Design and Web Premium, Okay, I have no idea. It's wonderful stuff. I just go, oh my gosh, that's so terrific. It's not that easy to take that class, but you probably can audit it if you ever want to. I would imagine you can. It's right here on campus. They do a lot of work. They have these 3 pictures on their website, but the little devils did not tell us what they're pictures of. So probably there's some student's picture that they decided to put up as examples. On that? I wouldn't know. I'm going to take your word for it. And according to the geography department, it was established in 2007. They're also very big on GIS, and everybody knows that. You use it in your car, it's on the weather systems, on the television, it's everywhere. So, and it works with this as well. So they teach that in that geography class as well. The facility was funded by a grant from NASA with matching funds provided by the geography department. And it combines a dedicated teaching laboratory with state-of-the-art research and image processing facility. So if you have any youngsters, grandkids, whoever, who are interested, it's really a wonderful department to go work in. They're very oriented to their students. So this is an early satellite discovery. Has anybody ever heard of the Atlantis of the Sands? I had not heard that term before, but this is what they were looking for, a place called Ubar, and it's in the green circle up there. See those little things that look like scratches on lenses that go across, diagonally across that right-hand picture? Those are caravan trails, camel caravans. They saw them from space. They said, oh, look at that. You might not see them from the ground. Or if you did, you might not recognize what you were looking at. That for it to be etched into the ground like that, what does that mean? How many camels, how many years, how long were they doing this? This might have been 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, Ubar. This is in Oman in the Empty Quarter. It was the center of the distribution of frankincense, considered as valuable as gold at one time, storied as a magnificent town. Legend had it that the rulers became so wicked, God destroyed it. And it's mentioned in the Quran, as well as in the tale of the 1001 Arabian Nights. As archaeologists have discovered, the city was more likely destroyed because it was built over a limestone cavern, and eventually the city went down in a massive sinkhole. Eventually, everywhere the water holes dried, it was a little wetter back then, coastal routes became practical instead of caravan routes, and the city was forgotten by 300 AD, except mentioned in people was, is it a legend? Was it a real place? So finally, they were interested. They said, oh, look at this. Maybe we could find something by satellite. So by the early 1980s, archaeologists began clamoring at NASA's door, realizing that these views might be useful. One of the archaeologists was looking for the city of Ubar, and after discussion, it was agreed that part of the launch in 1984 of the Space Shuttle Challenger, 2 years before the tragedy of '86, would include shots of the Arabian Peninsula. The images popped up from beneath the sand, ancient caravan tracks leading to and from a buried city. It took another 9 years before ground truthing, which is what they call verifying what's seen in the satellite. Fantastic use, early use of satellite views. I just love those little scratches going across the thing there. That's what they look like. More satellite archaeology. Many of you have heard me talk about Sarah Parsak. Have you, or seen her on television? She is a specialist in satellite archaeology. She and her husband, Gregory Mumford, are Egyptologists, and she spends a lot of time looking down at the Earth through satellite views. She also has a group called Global Explorer. Has anybody heard of it? You can join, the average person can join. You can look for looting holes. It's not easy and it's kind of boring, but she's had thousands of people around the world sign up and actually find things that they believe should be protected or that are looting holes. In fact, she found that one, the one on the right. She found that 800 tombs, a necropolis near the village of Lisht. You could not see it from the ground at all. But she found it by seeing, she said, looting pits. Why are there looting pits there? So they ground truthed and discovered the reason for the looting pits was because there was a huge necropolis there and people were raiding those tombs. She recently did a live Q&A on National Geo Facebook. She's a really interesting young woman, a brilliant young woman. She's about 39, and she is a world leader in this particular field. I just think she's so much fun, and she's so enthusiastic and so bubbly. She really likes her work. So yeah.
What are looting pits?
Looting meaning they're people stealing. They're looting from those tombs, taking valuable items, you know, digging in the night and coming in there and taking things. If they find pots or if they find anything, they'll sell it on the black market. So there's a lot of looting at archaeological sites, particularly in Egypt. In fact, looting has been going on so long in Egypt, that's one of the reasons you never find treasures when you do find a great tomb. And that's why King Tut was so remarkable. The looters hadn't gotten to him. It was unusual to have anything left. This is interesting. This is what you would see in the middle if you and I were just driving by in a car. You'd see dirt. But what she sees using the images from a satellite are all these little squares. You see all those little squares up there? Those are streets, those are tombs, those are houses, which you cannot see because they're totally covered in sand. But the bricks used to make all these things are denser than the sand. So the satellite picks that up. That's the human eye view, and on the left is the satellite's view, showing there's a very large city there. Strange to say. And she's wonderful. If you want to look at Global Explorer, take a chance to look at it online. It's a lot of fun. She starts with Google Earth, but then she pays money to go use Digital Globe, which is more precise, smaller, that kind of thing. So she uses Google Earth to get started. She's a very interesting young woman. LiDAR, light detection and ranging. This is everywhere. It's part of what the police use when they're saying we're driving too fast, as a smaller version of it. You can use it on a golf course to measure your shot. Do any of you do that? Any of you have rangefinders on the golf course? Yeah, so that's part of this system. This shows you how it works. A drone or an airplane or a satellite going over an area. That's the canopy on the left. That's all trees, forest. You cannot see from the ground, you're not going to see anything. And without LiDAR, you're not going to see anything. But the LiDAR peers through the trees, through the leaves, not physically through the leaves, but through gaps in the leaves, and shows you there is a city under that canopy, which is really happening all over the world. It illuminates the gaps between the leaves, not physically passing through the leaves. So it is, and what it does is take numerous shots. So you have to end up stitching it together, reading, and you have to know how to use it. Even in dense canopy, some of the laser light is eventually going to make it to the ground. This is Connecticut. This is a forest now. This is the Paquak, I don't remember how to pronounce it, Patchogue State Forest in Connecticut. It is now completely forested over. But this is what LiDAR saw. Old farmsteads, old homes, brick walls, foundations, everywhere all over under that forest. Katherine Johnson, University of Connecticut, told National Geo in 2014 that she was interested as a child in Rhode Island because she played in the forest, saw house foundations and walls, and nobody seemed to know who put them there, how they got there. As a researcher, she realized that many of the lost sites did not appear in the historical records anywhere. Many of these were home sites that had been abandoned with industrialization, and people started going west. And so they just abandoned these homesteads, and the forest covered them up. If you and I were just walking in this forest, we might stumble over a foundation, but you'd never see exactly all of this that used to be there. This is what archaeologists do. That's ground truthing up there on the right. That took them 25 years of work to expose 9 square miles of Caracol, which is a Mayan city. When they did LiDAR, they realized Caracol was actually more like 70 square miles. So in 25 years, you can see how LiDAR's not going to do the excavation for you. But what it's going to tell you is that this was a much larger, much more important, much more populated city than was thought. And LiDAR, and then this is what you see on the ground, the middle one. That's very hard work. Ground truthing that for 25 years, that's why it took them so long to uncover 9 square miles. And part of the problem, of course, is looting occurs. If looters know you're working there and they are aware, you're going to have looting. So they really try to be protective. They don't always, one of the reasons they worry about LiDARs, they're afraid GPS addresses are going to be shown, and they don't want that shown. So they get a little squirrely about it because they're afraid of looting. This is what a virtual imagination of the city. You can see it's very extensive with a lot of agricultural land. There are pyramids, there are walls, there are roads. What is it they've discovered now with all the LiDAR work being done in Honduras and Guatemala, which are both heavily forested, virtually all the Mayan cities were connected by causeways wide enough to suggest that they were heavily trafficked and used for trade and other forms of regional interaction. These highways were elevated to allow easy passage even during rainy seasons. Now, they don't have horses, they don't have wheels, so everything is by road and by foot. But nevertheless, that's a lot of planning, that's a lot of engineering, that's a lot of labor. They had to have a large labor force to do that and provide enough food for them in the area. This is a lot of work. This was a very organized and complex society. And one of the things it's telling people is, oh my gosh, these people were, there's a lot more of these people than we used to think there were. These are the Tarascans. Has anybody been to Michoacan? Some of you have been. Did you see any of these ruins at all? I don't know how to pronounce that, Zinsansan. I like that. Zinsansan. I love that. Why don't we have cool names like that? In fact, the only cool names we ever have are usually in Spanish or some other language. So this is Diego Rivera's vision of the Tarascans. They were enemies of the Aztecs, very large. Unfortunately, not as many archaeologists and researchers have worked with the Tarascans as they have with the Aztecs and the Mayans. So they're now starting to work with them. This was their capital city. So you can see these were not a small, uncultured group, was it? Amazing remains and an amazing civilization that we've kind of overlooked. That is an ear spool, turquoise and obsidian from the Met Museum, 3 inches. They were centered in the basin of Lake Patcuaro. The largest remaining group were the Parapuecha, an advanced culture of metal makers, somewhat distinct from other Mesoamerican groups. They were in conflict with the Aztecs. And in fact, they made kind of a mistake, because when they found out the Aztecs had been sort of ground down by the Spanish, they invited the Spanish. And along with everybody else in Central America, they died of disease first and war second. This is Angamuco, which was discovered only recently, 2007. That's recent in archaeological terms. And it was a very large city. So here's the canopy that was covering it, 7,000 feet. There it is without the canopy on it. You can see all the lumps and bumps of pyramids and homes, that kind of thing. Archaeological work there for the Tarascans has not been as thorough as other areas of Mexico. Professor Fisher of Colorado State University was working with a group called Legacies of Resilience, the Archaeology of the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin. Don't ask me where they came up with that name, it's long. But it is an international group, several universities, many international students, and probably they do that to bring together grants and funds. Because he is studying a group not as well studied as others, he has gotten several very sizable grants from National Science Foundation and others. In 2007, they found Angamuco the old-fashioned way. I mean, you could see there were foundations and other things in this forest at 7,000 feet, but not much else. So they began to excavate, revealing a small city. LiDAR was done in 2011, revealing, to the shock of the archaeologists, a very large city. They estimate 100,000 people. The city contains walled roads, pyramids, ball courts, homes, platforms, elite neighborhoods. Neighborhoods typically, I don't live in one, so I understand why they do that. Neighborhoods typically also contain civic and ceremonial function areas, although some traditional archaeologists are distrustful of a new tool outside their area of expertise, shovel and spade versus LiDAR. It does provide a much wider perspective in the lives of these people than previously known. All LiDAR work is eventually expected to be ground truthed. So you can't just rely on the pictures, you have to go down there and start digging. Now we know it took them 25 years to do 9 square miles of caracals. So what do you think about LiDAR? Is it the full employment for archaeologists technology? It looks to me like we need a lot more archaeologists and that we need at least 100 years to go through some of this new material. Drones and archaeology. This is a 1,000-year-old Pueblo settlement near Chaco Canyon, and they were able to map detailed archaeological plans of a dozen ancient house compounds. They could not see it from the ground very easily. This one, very dry weather, exposed this crop mark in the shape of a circular henge. Stonehenge is a henge that happens to be stone. There are wood henges. This one is in Ireland near a very ancient monument. It's probably 4,000 to 5,000 years old, and it would have been 3/4 of an acre in size. So very large. It's a lot of work, a lot of labor, a lot of engineering. Who were these people who were doing it? What happened in Stonehenge is that groups or clans would come and work, and they would be supported while they were working, and then they would go home and work in the fields, whatever they had to do, and somebody else would come and work. This is probably something similar here. Archaeologists have recognized since the 70s that thermal images captured at an optimal time have the potential to reveal surface artifacts, subtle topography, and even subsurface architectural remains. However, it is only with the recent development of reliable and stable unmanned aerial vehicles that archaeological aerial thermography has become practical. Archaeologists now use these little drones for everything. Sometimes they need to do a landscape survey of their site, and rather than walking it around or taking pictures at intervals, they use a drone that'll give them a full picture of what's being done, how far they've gone. They use them constantly now. There are sites now, when you go on the internet, all they do is service archaeological sites and archaeological work with drones. So they're wonderful. I love them. I just don't want them in my backyard. But I love the work that they can do in conservation with animal observation, with floods, with fires. They're just wonderful little pieces of equipment. Drones again. This was interesting to me. I had never heard of these people before. They're some kind of either Babylonians or they were in conflict with the Babylonians. They're in a marsh in Iraq. And they ruled from about 2730 BC to 1460 BC. Texts have referenced them, but there was never sure knowledge. And what is on the ground is a small mound in a marshy area. You really can't see it very well. But from the air, you can see this. This is a castle or some kind of military installation from nearly, 4,700 years ago. But you couldn't see it walking on the ground. They believe it belongs to the Sealand kings. I'd never heard of these people before. There's a whole lot I haven't heard of. That's one of the things. This one, Salisbury Plain, which is where Stonehenge is. If you do ground penetrating radar, if you do aerial surveys, if you do anything, you find that Stonehenge is not alone on the Salisbury Plain. There are hundreds of large and small monuments that have either disappeared were there meant to be there temporarily, or there are burials there that we do not currently see. It just looks like a flat plain right now. But archaeologists are well aware that at one point in time, 4,000 years ago, this was very active with lots of activity, lots of burials, lots of monuments. And they just discovered another one. Somebody flew over this wheat field and happened to notice that shape. And it is a known shape, House of the Dead, where a number of Neolithic dead would have rested from about 6,000 years ago. Excavation has begun, but no publication yet. They're faster, more flexible, and cost less in resources than airplanes, although the equipment that they carry with them is quite expensive. The costs of some of them were like $24,000, $30,000. They're very expensive, but you can rent them rather than have to own them outright. So in the last few years, archaeologists have started testing both platforms and sensors, particularly for the following applications: three-dimensional, 3D documentation of archaeological excavations. 3D, it's a wonderful way to get your grant going. You've got 3D video done by drone to show the people you're asking for money from. 3D surveys, survey of the landscapes, exploratory aerial survey, and the archaeological survey of woodland areas. The scale of these applications has ranged from site-based to landscape-based, and they are generally of great interest, and it's growing. It's not even finished where it's going to be in a couple of years. Amateurs in Google Earth. I thought that was interesting. This man, Peter Welch, I said, gosh, there are people all the time thinking of businesses. I'm just not that clever. He makes his living identifying potential sites that could be excavated and organizing paid events to explore them further. So he takes a group of people with him that are interested in metal detecting, and they run around a field with the farmer's approval looking for things. Well, you don't just do it arbitrarily. He looks on Google Earth, and he looks at old fields that he knows have been plowed since medieval times, because the marks are specific for medieval plowing. And when they had a medieval plow and it ran into something in the ground, they usually didn't dig it up. They just left it there, and what they would do is plant a tree to mark where they should go around. So he looks for those little bumps in the hedges where there's a tree. And he knows it's medieval, once medieval plowing. When you dig there, you have a good chance of finding not just a big rock, but also something that may be of value. And this he found, and with the group he was with, in 2014. 5,000 gold coins, value about $1,500,000. Now he has to split it with the farmer and the other guys, but not a bad day's work. But I love the fact that he's using Google Earth and his knowledge of what medieval people did, why they planted a tree in the middle of a plow line. I thought that was very clever. Same thing with this man. He's a former Royal Marine working in Devon. He decided he would think like a Bronze Age person. He wanted to find Bronze Age sites. And so he did. He said, I'm going to look here because that's the kind of place someone who is a Bronze Age person in Devon would find water, resources, fields, etc., hunting. I'm going to look right here. What he didn't know was that that aerial photo from 1989 showed a Bronze Age square. He was using Google Earth. He said, I'm going to dig here. He found it because he was thinking Bronze Age. Here's how I thought. I'm going to use Google Earth to find what I think is probably going to be there. That's actually, if you think about it, pretty logical. Go where you think people are going to find water and resources. I thought it was wonderful. I love this guy. I just think it's so terrific that you make a living identifying potential sites. Now this gets turned over to archaeologists and to the British central government. You don't keep it for yourself. But you're paid for it. They pay a reasonable market value for what they find. And I think that's great because it encourages them not to be destructive. Not that that always works. but it does encourage them not to be destructive and not to loot. Pretty clever. So this is next month, October 11th, underwater archaeology. We're going to talk about it. It's also called maritime archaeology, marine archaeology. It's very much a specialist niche with specific skills required. This particular photo was taken at more than 200 feet underwater. You have to be an expert diver to go down that far and to be able to do a good job. This is a Russian find in the Black Sea in August. Roman and Greek wrecks, and they've been down there taking pictures and excavating, trying to do what they can, and brought up some things from the wrecks. But you really need to know what you're doing when you're diving there. So we'll be talking about, and it's very popular. They find a lot of wonderful things. So we'll talk about that next time.